CKC. I'm super excited to have you guys with us today. And we have Eric Breno joining us today to talk about nutrition for athletes. Eric is a nutrition lead at the Institut National du Sport Québec. I'm just going to get my video started as well here. Thanks for reminding me, Eric. Good job. You're on the ball. Yeah, Eric is a registered dietitian, and he also holds an International Olympic Committee Sport Nutrition Diploma and a master's degree in sport nutrition. We're going to be recording this webinar, and we'll have it available if anybody wants to watch it online on YouTube afterwards. So, and also thanks to those of you that registered for the workshop. We'll make sure that we get your credentials entered into the NCCP locker for those professional development points. And also we'll have a chat window at the end of the call for you guys to ask your questions, and Eric's going to save some time at the end, so keep that in mind. And we have an exciting session coming up in a couple of weeks on June 24th, where we're going to invite an athlete panel and some guests from our national teams to join us and talk about their careers, their training, maybe some marketing questions as athletes as well. So we have Katie Vincent, Laurence Vincent Lapointe, and we have Andrea Nelson, Cameron Smedley, and also Nick Troutman, a freestyle athlete, joining us for the next one. So I'm really looking forward to that. We'll probably be trying to use Zoom for that next call, change the format up a little bit, and if all goes well and we're lucky and the stars align, we'll try to stream it as well on our Facebook page. So look forward to seeing some of you come back and join us at the end of the month. So thank you very much, Eric, for joining us today. It's really exciting to have you with us. How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. And it's great to be invited to kind of help and share some information around
Yeah,
nutrition to
great. Well,
support
thank you.
athletes in your sport.
We chatted a little bit earlier just before we jumped on the call, and you're from Lancaster, but you work at the INS Institute in Montreal. So you live just a little bit outside on Montreal, but I'm not sure if some of our guests have been following the news in Montreal, but a little bit sad to hear that the humpback whale in Montreal has passed away. But there's some really incredible footage, video footage of a humpback whale swimming around in the St. Lawrence River over the past week. So kind of a cool story, but a sad ending with that happening. Eric, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your background in sport, maybe as an athlete, but also now you work as a nutritionist, and so how you got into working with canoe kayak athletes as well.
Yeah, so I guess to probably focus more on the present, but then give a little bit of a touch of past. Yeah, my sport involvement has been I guess played across both team sport setting and individual sport. From a team sport, basketball was kind of my entry point to high performance in Canada. So kind of pursuing a scholarship in the US during that period. And then there was a switch over into martial arts, which kind of what fed my sport involvement when I was even younger before my basketball. So kind of returned to martial arts and went into training while applying going through the university commitment. After working in healthcare as a dietitian, there was always a strong direct interest to kind of return to sport in some capacity in Canada, and small baby steps over time and networking and professional development has led to more and more opportunities to kind of work in the high performance sports system. Just literally starting from the grassroots, from clubs. Canoe kayak was probably one of my entry sports into organized sports as a dietitian out in Ottawa. So kind of operating through in that space in my local area in Cornwall where I was living at the time, and then just kind of progressively build to where I was working full time at the Canadian Sports Institute Ontario in Toronto for about 3 years, working with the national sports systems there. preparing for Rio, and then preparing for this next quad leading into Tokyo. And then during that, within that 4 year quad space, I kind of transitioned more into the lead role in the nutrition department at the Sports Institute in Montreal. That goes by the acronym ENS Quebec. So ENS Quebec is part of the Canadian Sports Institute network system. So it's just literally I've moved from Toronto over to Montreal, then operating more applied research projects and working with about I think it's 5 or 6 national sport teams right now out of Montreal. So definitely staying busy, and getting a wide taste, I suppose, of involvement in the Canadian elite sports systems, from direct involvement in the trench to more sciencey, lab-based type projects to innovate new strategies to be applied in the field, and some administrative stuff to kind of push policies and systems to help gel what we know and to put into practice in the space to influence more than just the one athlete, but systemically
Cool.
and
That's
socially.
awesome. And we all know that canoe kayak's your favorite sport. But what other sports do you work with?
So at the moment, from a national team level, yeah, there's definitely the canoe kayak program, boxing Canada, gymnastics Canada, volleyball men's Canada indoor, um, wheelchair para rugby, the para canoe kayak program, and fencing. So that's kind of my short list for this year as we move into Tokyo, and probably likely
Yeah. Oh, excellent.
into Paris.
And so, who are your typical clients? You work directly with the athletes? Do you also work with coaches sometimes?
Yeah, 100%. In fact, the it starts with mostly with the coaching staff. So I've kind of operate through as part of really the coaching unit. So I kind of just see myself as like a food coach, and then try to harmonize strategies that we can deploy to help support and harmonize against the coaching plan. And then from there, the task is to deploy those paper strategies into the field by educating, encouraging, and adjusting food intake behaviors through the athletes. Sometimes it requires some monitoring, so we kind of implement those pieces just to make sure that we're having a positive return on energy spent, on performance or health, to improve athlete robustness for ongoing training at intensities that are required at certain periods of the year. And then on the switch, sometimes we deal with rehab situations. So more and more, there's opportunity to gather information to apply nutrition stimulus around rehab strategies to help kind of put the athlete return to play pathway a little bit more efficiently, and then perhaps prevent any sort of secondary collapse while they are reintroduced back into play. So we just have a more robust athlete to kind of capitalize on
Right.
days or maybe
Okay. Well,
longer
that's excellent.
in the season.
Um, So actually, I don't know if everyone can see it, but on the left of your screen here next to our video, we do have a poll that I opened up, and it's basically asking what your favorite post-nutrition snack is. And since we have Eric here, a nutritionist, I thought it would be a good question to see. So just take a minute and or a few seconds to answer that poll if you haven't already. Um, and basically, what's your fit? What do you like to have after your workout? Is it a protein shake? Do you like meal replacement bars, or are you more of a have some fruits? Chocolate milk is a popular one, I know. Maybe you like to have a little bit of everything that's on this list, or maybe you're also of the mindset that if the fire is burning hot enough, it will burn any fuel that you give it. So it doesn't seem to be a popular one here. Okay, we're gonna broadcast these results and end the poll. Can you see that poll, Eric? So, so how did we do?
Yeah, that's perfect. So I'm just gonna do a quick note. Yeah, yeah, no, I think this kind of characterizes the reality, and I think that's the beauty of it. Fortunately, there's many different ways you could angle a strategy on recovery. Everything is driven by context, of course, but I think from a functional perspective, I think everyone's on the same page. Clearly, there's different stylistic approaches, But like I said, depending on the context and frequency of use, it can all fit at one time in the calendar year. And so what we'll do in the presentation is try to kind of offer that context so that one doesn't have to particularly be overly guilty to apply one strategy versus the other. But then if you find yourself in a pattern of use that's limited to a strategy and you have other goals that you want to manage simultaneously, then you might better appraise as to whether or not what you're doing is a little too narrow of a goal achieving, or can you broaden your strategy to do multiple things at once, which is going to be really required in
Yeah,
your
I
life.
remember back in my days when we were training, one of the athletes in my training group, she'd always say, would you put diesel in a Ferrari engine? If somebody was having a bad snack after a workout, and then another person would respond back and say, if that fire is burning hot enough, it'll burn anything. But yeah, no, science is definitely what wins out in this argument. So I'll pass it over to you. We're going to go to our presentation window here, and I'll get my turn my video off, and we'll pull up your presentation, and then you can take it away.
All right, perfect, perfect. Yeah, so I've kind of made the intention of titling this, around increasing training outcomes and competitive readiness, and just put like a small jab that yes, we are going to be talking about nutrition, but there's a way to kind of review nutrition strategies in sports. I think sometimes there's a way of presenting it where it becomes a very black and white kind of approach to management, or you could kind of present the nutrition strategies within the reality of the science, meaning that the objective you're probably looking for is probably a little bit more narrow in terms of what you think, like passes the sniff test or that you're trending in the right spot. But the nutrition strategy that you could assemble around the effort of improving performance or health outcomes are probably a little bit more diverse. And the diversity is going to be dependent on a couple of things. It's going to be dependent on the athlete's interest, the knowledge the athlete has, both on the strategy scale of nutrition or just the food. Knowing what types of foods can be assembled and in what combinations can they be assembled to achieve the strategic outcome, assuming they know what that is, to enhance the performance gains or improve the adaptations of the training or to recover from it. So that's going to be one thing. And then there's other things as well that's probably a little bit more at the social economic scale of things. Food availability, food affordability, culinary comfort in assembling pieces together. It could even go into lifestyle management, and which could probably be more of something adults can empathize with is, can you put together a knowledgeable nutrition plan in a week where you're just being bombarded by 20 different things, half of which is probably sports driven and the other half is academic, maybe with a little bit of family component and friends and all that other stuff that is important for overall global healthy life. But can you assemble this stuff consistently for 52 weeks out of the year? Heck, even if you take 4 weeks off, you still have to do it 48 weeks out of the year, which can be taxing on anyone. So it's kind of there's a range of kind of things that needs to kind of come together well as to consistently deliver on nutrition strategies to enhance performance. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but then give it a little bit of a seating frame, and then we'll kind of grow it out a little wee bit. So we'll cover the nutrition for developing athlete and performance, move into something a little bit more granular that can be applied, to my knowledge, from what I've heard, at least at the national level. There's not any competitions coming up this fiscal because of the whole COVID and public health policies and whatnot. But depending on what the training objectives are in your club or with your training groups, there might be an emphasis on sparing or increasing lean mass and strength. And then we can move on to some eating and drinking strategies that can be applied in a more kind of heavier training load environment. And then entering into the space of quality assurance in terms of, again, food choices or product choices around nutrition to kind of put together and to allow the strategies to actually come alive. But then doing it in a way that supports quality assurance, because that could get kind of tricky on a good day. So we'll cover that. So if we start with just like the broad picture, kind of just setting the tone, because I'm probably speaking to, a wide coaching audience with, I would assume to have a wide diversity of athletes under their care, perhaps ranging from non-competitive, possibly into competitive, competitive across age groups, across stages of performance development, and possibly some even at the elite level that are carded provincially or nationally. You'll notice that if you are dealing with that melange of athlete pool, it will not be cookie cutter on a good day. You're going to have some diversity of learning objectives there, not just in sport, but even from the nutrition sport pathway. So this image was published not too long ago through a position paper. I don't think this one specifically the International Olympic Committee, but there was a collection of papers that were published roughly within the quarter of the year, those tackling some of the topics on supplementation and what are the new position and guidelines around it. And so this one image was very fitting in a sense of just capturing kind of the work that I do in the field, but just doing it in one image. And so, if you find the majority of your groups are in that development space pathway, you might notice that there's definitely a strong argument to kind of look into the knowledge base of food, look at the knowledge base of assembling food for training, in both the preparation for training, especially the harder ones, to recovering from those sessions, so that they could get on with their days to whatever the other percentage of their days is they're responsible to, whether it's school or family or anything else, or possibly on the double. If they're engaging already in double session days, then you want to make sure that the athlete is ready throughout the entire day period of training, so that you could get, for one, good quality workout, so that stimulus could then marinate long enough to generate some solid adaptations over the end of the training cycle, but also negate any risks of injuries. Especially if you have that motivated athlete that'll just kind of train right through any form of fatigue. If there's some of that layer of fatigue that could be cut, because you could actually feed into a better energy state, then that kind of reduce the risks of injuries, making sure they're not overreaching in the session. So again, there's a lot of ways that could be very good, just focusing on the whole food strategy elements of things. Not only that, it builds the base competency required to command the majority of nutrition strategies that has to occur in a automated sort of kind of way with the national program, or at the elite level. It's not uncommon, even for me now, working with either medalists or those on the national team hoping to podium, for us to actually go back into the whole food inventory strategy and clean some of those pieces up, realign them so that they're a little bit more harmonized to the training block or the overall global training strategy for the year. It's always dynamic. It never stays the same. Whatever we program in January does not look the same in August or November. And so there's a level of livingness to the way we program the whole food nutrition pieces so that it harmonizes right through the objective of training right across the annual training plan. And then there might be some emphasis on a couple of pieces just to really kind of squeeze some juice out of the training lemon, so to speak. And then depending on one of the gaps that exists at that point, then we start looking at a very kind of evidence-based approach to kind of using dietary or other supplementation practices for both either managing what is known, confirmed deficits in nutrients through blood work review. So for example, like iron or vitamin D levels, and to looking at other strategies to enhance the physiology related to the training adaptations that we're looking for. But because the percentages of gains through those supplementation rounds are very small, and the options of effective supplements, again, are very small, where you get the most gains is through the whole food strategy, because it's balancing a very large responsibility to the athlete's ability to cope to the training, maintain capacity at the level that is required from what the coach wants, and then drive those adaptations during the recovery phase. And so you're going to get a much more bang for your buck using that whole food, making sure those strategies are aligned. And then you could couple some other layers in for just extra quarter percentage points. So here I'll kind of give you an idea or a view of what I meant by that. So what we'll do is we'll kind of jump into the granular space around eating for lean mass and strength. It's often commands a high level of attention across the canoe kayak kind of preparation calendar. I would say it's like it almost feeds into like almost half of the conversations that I have with the national team guys and with the coaches. We're trying to always make sure that those elements are in place. And so if you look at, I guess for one thing, when talking about nutrition, to put it in context, one is you're doing an injustice if you don't underscore the importance of training and from a coach, your contribution to the development pathway. Your role is incredibly important, and the stimulus you inject into the athlete to develop them into athletes is a very primary stimulus. Like I could get someone to eat really well and they could still not be a good athlete. The training is going to be the major thing. However, it's a percentage of the equation to, especially when we're talking about elite level, it's a percentage of the puzzle to get to elite consistent status. And so that's where the nutrition kind of comes in. So there's definitely a codependence of the two coming together. But again, the nutrition only kind of makes sense if it's wrapped around training, because it is an important driver for performance there. So when we're talking about lean mass and strength, from a training perspective, we're looking at resistance training, very important stimulus. You're going to get a response either way, but then there's a way to amplify and support that stimulus from a dietary perspective. And in this case, we're looking at protein. So again, how you assemble your protein to meet to get the response that you're looking for, that amplification of response. There are many ways to slice that, but then we could kind of simplify things just by get the framework in mind, know what the evidence is, and then from there you could kind of color the pages as to how food comes together. So if you look at the image on the left, I have a broad category of protein-based options there. Now I'm trying to remember if that actually has, yeah, there's legumes in there too. So you got some plants, you got some animal protein pieces in there. Some athletes might be more biased to one version or another. Let's not worry about that right now. If we look at it from an actual physiological perspective, there is a sweet point around protein requirements for the day to kind of get the system to respond. And so more protein is better up to a point. And the sweet spot right now, if we were to be very numerical about it, appears to be around that 1.6 bandwidth, that very little tight bandwidth there of 1.6 grams per kilo. Now, if you want to run the math on that one, so again, if someone is 50 kilos, and I don't know how many paddlers actually weigh 50 kilos, but let's say it's a 50 kilo. I mean, you're looking at probably close to like 75 grams of protein, a little bit more than that, for that form of athlete. For most athletes, I guess paddlers that are probably sitting in the 60s, 70, 80 kilo range, you're probably seeing some paddlers needing around 120 to 150 grams of protein. Now, I'll kind of give you an imagery as to what that looks like, but just remember roughly above the century mark to maybe 150 is kind of like where most targets would be. Now, again, you can meet this objective through whole food approaches, because if you look at how much just simply 20 grams of protein looks like, you could just start by picking up your cell phone and just visualizing a cooked piece of meat around the size of your cell phone will probably deliver close to 25 grams of protein. So if you're an athlete that needs 100 grams, well, you probably just need, theoretically, 5 pieces of meat that's about this size. But clearly you could get protein through other forms of food, not just animal meat. You could get it through dairy products. So again, if you're looking at an example of a dairy product that delivers 20 grams of protein, you're probably looking at a fist of Greek yogurt. If it's a glass of dairy milk, or even if it's soy milk, it would be roughly 2 fists, so 2 cups. So those are kind of like the rough exchanges to kind of give you the same dosing amount of protein. And if you're an athlete that knows that you have to have roughly 100 grams, well, then basically you could just at least, account for your meal prep and just say, oh, well, at least 2 out of 3 meals is going to be a meat. So I need at least a couple of pieces of cell phone of meat cooked throughout the day. And then how you want to eat for breakfast. Maybe it's eggs, maybe one day it's a bowl of cereal, but then just portion out your dairies or your plant-based proteins accordingly to get the amount of protein. So you're probably looking at an athlete eating 4, maybe 5 times a day during a heavier training period in order to achieve those protein targets. Now, this here shows you, well, why is the 1.6 a sweet point? So the graph was making reference to changes in lean mass. But then if you look at information, I was looking at a collection of studies that's looking at, does protein favor increase in lean mass and strength? These graphs right here, just most recently published, kind of highlights the trend. So what these studies have done is each of those studies, which you see on the very small fonts there on the left side of the graphs, those are all different types of studies that were compiled over time. And in the first half, where you see there's two words that are bolded. So the first bold, and then you see this long list of stuff at the top, those are untrained test subjects. And then the small little slice below, right to the next bold, those are studies that are kind of good quality looking at trained subjects. And basically what each of these studies had in common was they had two groups of athletes doing the same training, one doing a more reduced version of a protein intake, whereas the other ones were eating the higher dosing protein intake, the one like I showed you in the graph. So really doing nothing different from training, but just changing the protein dosing. And if you look at the untrained group at the very top, the black dot tells you kind of how things are trending across all the studies. And so you can see that there's a bit of if you're on the right side of that dash line, it's kind of favorable to eating a little bit more protein to get enhancements in lean mass, which is the graph on the left. So those are all the different studies that are showing trending increase in lean mass just by changing protein and not so much the training. But then if you slide down to the bottom, you can see all the studies that are looking at the train group. The black dot swings pretty further to the right from the dash line. And so that kind of gives you a bit of perspective where when you just start out as someone, let's say a recreational athlete or someone just coming into the sport and just starting weightlifting, the more important part is going to be the training. You're going to get a lot of lean mass that way. You still need to eat some protein, but the training will really kind of cover a lot of loose ends. But to a certain timeline, at one point when the body starts to adapt to this form of stress because it's being imposed regularly across the week, one week after the other, then in the train group, it tells you that there's a little bit more sensitivity to the nutrition strategies now. So it's going to complement and enhance the training that's already been embedded and just routined over weeks. So then you can start seeing a bit of a context swing there. But if you look at the overall general between trained and untrained for gains in lean mass, there's a red dotted circle at the bottom, and next to that is a 0.3 kilo. So that's generally you'll see a 30% improvement in lean mass gains just by bumping up protein when you collect all the studies together. But just realize with the train group, you get way more effect, which means the physiology is a little bit more sensitive there, especially if they've been training for a longer time compared to others. If you swing to the graph on the right, same design in terms of how it's set up, like the information, but now you're looking at strength. So here you could see that there's a bit more of oftentimes like a better improvement on strength gains in the trained group than you would in the untrained group, which is the entire big list at the top. But if you collate it all together and you just kind of average them out, it favors increased strength. So you could produce more peak force at the end of a training block by supporting that training with just a bit more protein, like what we were talking about. So that's kind of like the more up-to-date narrative on the effects of protein intake there. Does this chart include both genders? Some of the studies do include both genders, but I don't recall which ones of which in there are just exclusively males or females there. And like I would reckon if presuming everything is the same, I think more from a clinical context, I guess although there's no we can't slice and dice it with these graphs. I find that in the like in the real world, when I take like a compilation of my case studies, both men and women completing a hypertrophy block, generally speaking, if we feel confident that they're applying, this strategy among others, just to kind of put all the pieces together for effective muscle hypertrophy, I find generally speaking the rate of gain of lean mass uh, trends relatively the same or in competition with males. I think where you start seeing a difference is in probably the amount they're starting with and the amount that they could probably end with, because the skeletal size, the skeleton proportions are kind of like I find a very big driving force on putting on lean mass on a body more than gender per se. There's a study that I published 2 months ago, and that was done with Olympic athletes from the last 2 years in Toronto. And the just to give you an example, the one subject that had the most muscle for their height was a female shot putter, and I had mixed sports in there that include paddlers. And what was really different with that athlete is just the broadness of their skeleton, and that seems to correlate quite a bit in the amount of muscularity you could anchor onto that frame. She was multiple standard deviations past any muscular guy that I had in the data set from wrestlers, paddlers. Um, I think I had a couple of combat athletes that were pretty muscular in the heavyweight class as well. The next question is, what type of athletes are on this list, and does it matter? No, this is just looking at physiology. So the one thing to take away with this is it does matter with the athlete in a sense. So for example, if you're looking at a technical sport where there isn't a lot of weight training imposed, then you could probably put them into I wouldn't say untrained, but they would definitely fit more into that mold. Whereas with the trained group, oftentimes you're looking at, in these types of studies, you're probably looking at collegiate level athletes where there is a regular dosing of weightlifting across the fiscal year. Normally, when we get, I don't know if you see the same, but when I start seeing athletes move into various phases of their development pathway, and especially if they had a period where weight training wasn't that dominant, when they enter into the high performance space and it's in a space where weight training is infused regularly, we'll see often a quick ramp up in the adaptation and the muscularity. So sometimes you kind of get a doubling of the rate of what you would see, but it tends to plateau after a quarter. Um, because then when we do the next hypertrophy block after we get through kind of like a power phase and we kind of reboot quite a bit later, we can't seem to simulate that same rate of gain, and then you start kind of seeing the typical kind of gain of a kilo of lean mass a month kind of thing, whereas sometimes you can see it double in the first hypertrophy block, but assuming they're kind of going in with no weight training history. So yeah, there's a kind of bit of a context there to that. So if we're looking at dialing the proper dose of protein, coincidentally, I mentioned increments of 20 grams. It's probably because I kind of built into memory now, just from a teaching perspective, the small functional units of protein intake. So generally speaking, when people have tried to systematically learn, how the body responds to protein in a dose response manner, so kind of like in the moment, um, there's some information that allows us to kind of appreciate that there's like a bit of a tipping point near, I guess, from an easy visual, that 20-30 gram kind of dose chunk. Technically, if you read the paper, it's at around like 0.3 grams per kilo. But given that most people on average are athletes that are studied are 70 to 80 kilos, the numbers tend to break out at around 25 gram increments. There are some exceptions where you could see, like that last bullet point near the 40 isn't necessarily flat out, but again, it's one study with a small sample size, so there might be some argument to be made on more muscular athletes, probably closer to the 100 kilo range or more. where they could potentially benefit from a little bit more of a higher dose. At some points, it's probably less about the dose and just more about the convenience of getting their protein demands into a 12-hour wake period, because it becomes impractical to keep slugging back 20 grams of protein over 12 hours. As a 120 kilo athlete, you'll just be eating every 30 minutes. So likely that's not going to happen. So there is probably a better use of just assimilating larger chunks of protein doses from a practical standpoint. But at the same time, there might be an argument that they could actually handle that dosing from a metabolic perspective and not just oxidize it and not have it used effectively. Now, again, how to get that dose? Again, we kind of covered a couple examples where, the cell phone of cooked meat, whether it's fish, pork, beef, or chicken. It could be a fistful of legumes, so whether it's beans, I'll kind of give you roughly around 15 to maybe 16 grams of protein. So you probably need a little bit more than that actually, just to kind of get a nice kind of a slight overdose of around 25, just because the quality of the protein is not quite the same as animal from a muscle stimuli response. So you may have to compensate just by upping up the portion a little wee bit there. But then dairy, which is a good quality protein in terms of the amino acid trigger, the leucine to activate muscle protein synthesis. Greek yogurt would be a fifth glass of liquid dairy, whether it's milk, chocolate milk, or whatever, would be 2 cups. And so that, and then if you're looking at pieces of cheese, it'd be like kind of 2 fingers stuck together. So that width, length, dimension will give you roughly close to 20 grams of protein. So then you could start kind of visualizing how it's not necessarily the one specific way of dealing with the demand. You have a diversity of options. So do you need the protein powders? Not if you have an appetite for some cheese and some milk, and some Greek yogurt and slices of meat spread across the day. But again, how that gets managed may not just be a knowledge related issue. It might be a culinary comfort perspective. It could be a meal menu management skill when multiplied with a bunch of other responsibilities over the day. So there's other factors that kind of roll into real life that influences whether or not someone actually execute on what they know. And so sometimes when there's a gap there, most humans will kind of move like nature, where there's, you kind of move where there's less energy required to achieve tasks. And so sometimes the protein powders are pulled out for no other reason than just filling in a gap related to management skill. And so, but sometimes when you repackage the strategies, an athlete will self-reflect and realize, oh, well, yeah, you know what, there's probably 3 other convenient ways in which I could kind of achieve my protein targets. But again, those protein choices, for example, if you're picking if you're picking meat in place of a protein powder, well, you kind of get a double layered goal there, in the sense that the meat contains iron to fuel iron requirements, to help support endurance capacity, to help support immune function during heavy doses of training. And so that's kind of an example of where you're kind of using one item to deal with multiple objectives, whereas the protein powder just gives you the protein for the muscle, but then it may not offer anything else. So again, kind of thinking broadly to kind of put it together. Now there's another element around timing of protein. It's not uncommon where I hear, gotta have protein immediately right after training. From a reality perspective, you're going to get a strong response within the hour of training. So in many cases, what drives me to push an athlete to have the protein immediately after training versus just, wash off your stuff, take a shower, and then eat, is going to be driven more on, well, what's coming up. So if there's training coming up in 6 hours or less, then really we want to start priming the system a little wee bit to kind of push itself to recover for the next effort. Or it could be just more of a kind of like a conflict of schedule. So maybe there's going to be anticipation of items coming in that could disrupt mealtime pattern eating. And so, probably best to have it sooner rather than later. So it's not so much driven by physiology. It's more driven by just disruptions to the overall nutrition management for the day. And so sometimes there's ways you can kind of readjust your messaging on the timing of protein intake. The last graph, it's more for senior athletes. So again, just realizing that even though you're training well, eating protein, there could be other nutrition strategies or nutrition items that could fall into play as well, just from a socialization perspective. And so if that kind of routinely gets offset or kind of integrated without management, then it can actually kind of manage or suppress some of the physiology or the training adaptations that can occur. And so this is not necessarily a graph I'm pointing out just for canoe kayak. It's generally a slide I apply for different sports, but just an appreciation of those factors that could come into play. So again, more of a, especially for the senior athletes, making sure that there's a balance of, when it comes to social nutrition, make sure that kind of gets thoughtfully put through depending on what the training demands are. Now, I guess I'll kind of pause here before I jump into hydration requirements, but any questions on protein in relation to the lean mass and strength? I'll just wait a few seconds. All right. So now if we move on to hydration, I guess really we all intuitively know that hydration is important. We know that it takes a higher level of importance when the athlete is training under heat stress conditions. Just as a general reminder, from a physiological perspective, what happens in dehydration is you get an impact or an assault on the cardiovascular system. And so because of loss of fluid, there's going to be some adjustments or some impacts that will occur. So one will be blood flow to working tissues. So in the context of training, you'll get reduced perfusion of liquids going into those working tissues. The heart will then compensate by trying to increasing rate of pressure or beats to maintain pressure to kind of drive fluids into that space to exchange nutrition and pull out byproducts of metabolism, just to kind of keep things going. But from a functional perspective, when you're under that kind of stress or under that tipping point of stress, then there's some functional components that come into play. And then appreciating that also kind of allows you for, what am I going to get in terms of athlete quality training? What am I going to get in terms of risks of injury? And then what am I going to get from an adaptation, right? So adaptation is dependent on the quality of the training. So you can almost kind of forecast, how's this whole thing in a domino. So from a functional perspective, if we start just with the tissues involved with neuro, you could, in terms of central nervous system, there could be an increase in perceived effort. It's kind of important to account, as you could probably appreciate, because for some athletes, triggering a little high on there actually might cue them to be more guarding, will guard their effort. So they'll probably put less of their effort in just because they perceive things are a little difficult, especially if that feeling gets triggered early on in the session. There could be psychomotor function impairment there. So, what quality from if the sessions focus on technical or you're trying to implement technical learning skills into a more race-paced type of movement, what kind of quality are you going to get out of that? That's the person in the state of dehydration. And then there's just overall intensity capacity. So can they maintain higher intensity endurance outputs? Because that's going to be the first thing to go. And then strength and power. So again, are you getting the elements at a quality that you want going in, and what's disrupting it? Hydration potentially, if not managed well in sessions. And so in terms of how to monitor, you're probably going to need a collection of viewpoints to kind of assemble together to get a decent impression as to what the situation is. Here's a good kind of model made available a while back, and it kind of holds itself even right now. We're looking at several markers. So one will be a thirst marker. Now a thirst marker is good just to identify early signs of thirst. It doesn't tell you how bad things are kind of getting. And so if at least you have a thirst cue being cued, something's already, you got a rod in the fire already for dehydration. But if you get into the habit of collating that information along with urine concentration, particularly in the morning on the first void, so having an athlete kind of monitor the color, and there's some of these color scale images that one could use to kind of allow the athlete to code, the color. And so if you have a darker shade, complaints of thirst, or just kind of perception of thirst cued in, you're feeling way more confident that you're kind of in an underhydration kind of situation. Now, in terms of managing hydration over the course of a day, you can do like one day to the other weight checks. So the weight is not so much telling you much about fat mass or lean mass if taken one day after the other, but it's telling you more information about fluid shifts. So if an athlete comes in on a Monday weighing at a certain amount, does training, and the next day is 1 or 2 kilos lighter, that's not fat tissue, that's fluid. So that's possibly 2 liters of fluid that's differential from the first day. And if you hear that athlete, saying just they're thirsty or have dry mouth, and they also made a note that their urine color was dark that morning, and you're facing with a double session, Tuesday morning followed by a Tuesday afternoon, that athlete has some catch up to do. So they're already compromised leading into the first session. And the first session might actually make things worse in the roll into the second session, which might be more intensive depending on how you program. So by racking all these different markers together, it just starts really building some weight as to urgency of hydration, rather than looking at these pieces in isolation. So if we look at an example here, one starts a session. I mean, here's an example of actually looking at it within the same day. So let's say there's a pre-training weight at 72 kilos. After training, there's 71. There's a body change deficit of -1 kilo, plus the fluids they drank, and they didn't go to the bathroom. They lost around close to 2 liters of fluid right there, which accounts for a 2.5% weight change. And so that kind of just simply informs you that there is a rate of fluid loss depending how long the session is. So if we assume this is a 2-hour session, there's a 1 liter loss per hour session that the athlete will have to stay accountable for. And then there's thresholds as to how low the body can manage itself to the point where you start getting functional deficits. So in this example, this athlete lost 2.5%. Does it really matter? I think in the next slide, Dwight. Yeah. So on the next slide, this tells you a little bit of context or the consequences of dipping into lower bandwidths of fluid weight loss. So if in the milder sense you lose 1% of fluid, the worst thing is the body will just kind of cue itself to top itself up. So get the brain kind of sending a message to, I'm thirsty, just drink. Some athletes are good at listening it, some not so good. So, how does someone respond to that cue could vary, but it's probably going to start there. At that 2% weight fluid loss margin, then you start kind of dipping into, and again, having sensitive tools could probably pick this up. I'm not quite sure how good the eye test would be, but then you start seeing some gradual diminishing on skill level and decision-making ability. So again, depending on what tasks are in front of the athlete, under what restrictions, you may or may not see it. So it just depends on what your performance tolerance is in that session there and what the goal is. But then if it is heavily dependent on skill acquisition, strategy, and timing, then just being 2% off can disrupt the athlete's ability to learn, in that bubble there. Once you start moving into lower space at around 2.5%, and I believe that was in the case that we saw, that's kind of a threshold point where you start seeing diminished capacity on high intensity performance. And so you might get some signs of earlier onset fatigue, which can be important if the session is designed to maintain a quality pace throughout. So if you're getting early onset fatigue, then it's the athlete's ability to engage the stimulus you program to be ready for whatever's coming up can be impaired. So you're kind of like taking a step behind and maybe relying on multiple more sessions to build that athlete up. On a 3% body weight loss, then you start seeing some power output diminishing there. So at that point, it just gets generally more serious, and it just stacks. So again, at that 3% body weight loss, you lost power, you lost endurance, high intensity performance, you're getting fatigued sooner, and you probably can't think through much things. So then now you're kind of dealing with a shell of an athlete, possibly beginning a session if they started the day really off on the wrong foot. So then you almost have to kind of decide, well, do we keep going through this, or do we just ditch this and we just kind of get you all built up and recovered so that you could kind of handle the session with the quality on demand? So again, that's kind of ways of thinking about it, and that's just looking at performance, not even looking at injury risk. So if someone, God forbid, gets hurt simply because of this controllable factor, well, that could have a more larger impact on the development and just safety of the athlete there. Any questions on fluid before we jump into eating from a refueling perspective? All right. Now, eating for recovery, the nutrient that takes command under this topic will be carbohydrates, just because in the context of high performance, not high performance, but high intensity output ability, carbohydrate is definitely going to be the fuel fraction that kind of deals with the body's ability to deliver at that space of intensity there. So from a metabolic perspective, it's definitely the most preferred fuel source from an intensity, high intensity bandwidth efforts. That fuel stock does get stored in the muscle for quick accessibility, but the storage capacity is limited. There's another storage reservoir of glycogen, which is a stored form of carbohydrate from what you eat in the liver. But accessibility to there is not as efficient as in the muscle, especially in the context of exercise. So the liver is kind of more important than just maintaining blood glucose levels, so you don't get into a hypoglycemic state and just not be able to function. So it's important for playing that role. The stored glycogen or carbohydrate in the body that's in the muscle, that does not come out into the bloodstream. It's all the blood sugar stuff is happening because of the liver's ability to pump things out of supply. But the muscle, it just gets stuck there and it doesn't come out until it's used. And so those high intensity efforts will chip away at that reservoir to the point where it then becomes really dependent on what you're eating in the moment to try to compensate, assuming you're still training at that higher intensity. So in terms of what your requirements are, this is a little bit more complicated than protein. Protein, you could kind of get away with eating the same amount right across a training block, possibly even leading to the taper. I mean, there's arguments to adjust it, but I mean, assuming you're just going to simplify life a little wee bit, you could keep that high protein intake on a day off, double day, single day, right through the week. And it's going to support the adaptations that kind of fester over multiple days from the weightlifting, or do some micro repair in the day leading into the next session. When it comes to carbohydrate, it's a little bit more dynamic. So this is where a lot of energy is spent on my end with the national programs, is trying to figure out when to infuse a certain amount into the system to support certain intensities that the coach has programmed. And so oftentimes we'll sit down and I'll take a look at what the program is coming up for that week or that training block. And then we start kind of assembling the athlete's awareness around, okay, well, how much supply do you tend to need over this week? How much is going to flow into the double sessions leading into the first and then on the day offs? So there's always going to be access, but the pitch of access is going to be very dynamic and it's going to be dependent on the training, so that we could get optimized recovery, but then at the same time optimize the training quality, so that the objectives are achieved based on what the head coach is assigned. And so you'll see in the next slide, I believe, there's going to be a little bit more dynamic approach there. So here, this table, it's dated back almost 10 years ago. But it is still relevant in the sense that the information that's published right up until now is relatively consistent. If anything, just building our confidence that these initial perceptions were pretty bang on. So here you could see, I think you could see, that there's I've isolated two pockets of information here that could be um, used within the context of kayaking, canoe kayak. And here you could see, starting with the circle, when I made reference to the different bandwidths of budgets, you could see that if we look at or break down training from from markers of light, moderate, high, and very high, and you can get pretty granular as to what those metrics would be. You could start seeing, though, a couple columns over around carbohydrate targets. You can see that the bandwidths of how much grams a kilo per kilo one would consume, it starts to change across those bandwidths. So within this context, it's not uncommon during kind of like in a general preparation phase, let's say in January, February, when there's ski camps or like just some aerobic buildup leading into the more specific prep stuff if going to Florida. Um, like we're probably clipping close to that moderate high, depending on the training program. And then it might get closer to the low end of high to the high end of moderate in the specific prep phase, depending on some of the volumes that are being achieved there. And then we start gradually moving into the lower end of moderates to maybe lights as we approach taper or recovery week. Again, depending on how that's scheduled, leading into, let's say, team trials in April. And then we kind of recycle, okay, what's it look like once the team is assembled and we move on to Worlds or Olympics or something. So we start kind of breaking the blocks down and see how this all kind of comes in together. Now the yellow highlight down there at the bottom, remember when I was highlighting with the protein, like how soon would you want to consume protein? They said there was probably two factors. One is, when's the next training coming up? Or is there a lifestyle disruption or something that could dictate it? So one's physiological, one's social. From a speedy refueling perspective, here it's less flexible. So there's a moment in the time window after training where the body is very sensitive to, or the muscle is sensitive to seeing blood glucose, and it has the ability to pump in carbohydrates through the bloodstream within a small bandwidth window after training. So if the training day is going to be massive in the sense that, let's say if there was like a technical and low intensity type water paddle session in the morning followed by weightlifting, so the intensity then suddenly ramps up a bit, but then within 2 to 3 hours later you have a more intensive session starting at 4 or 3, depending on when you can get to the water. Well, in that case, you're probably going to want to depend on a speedy refueling strategy around carbohydrates. And the dosing that's given there as an example is 1.0 to 1.2. So that's kind of like the sweet zone for dosing. So like if someone of like 80 kilos is trying to, achieve those targets, you're probably looking at, 2 pieces of fruit, let's say 2 cereal bars, and 2 or 3 breakaways of Greek yogurt. So between the Greek yogurt, you got your 20 gram protein, and then the fruit and the cereal bar that complements the carbohydrates that's in the yogurt will collectively give you the dosing of carbohydrates to refuel the muscle leading into the afternoon, assuming you had a very busy morning. So again, you can apply these tactical elements using a combination of foods, and I just kind of picked my easy go-to one there, the dairy, fruits, and cereal, just because they're portable. But there's many ways you could assemble a kit there that can achieve the same outcome. But consuming that has to happen a little quicker, so that physiologically you could top up real quick leading into the afternoon. Now, if it was a situation where the day of training ends after the weight, then you can kind of eat within that 1 hour window. The carbohydrate is not necessarily as important to top up because you still have possibly another 12 hours into the next session. So as long as you can maintain your carbohydrate requirements for the day, the muscle will have sufficient time to kind of refuel itself for the following session the next day. So that's kind of bringing to my point around everything I've talked about had some level of exception to the rule. And that's just kind of highlighting the reality of the science is that there's a very dynamic way, like at least at the higher level of nutrition programming for sport performance, there's a dynamic element to this. You're probably scratching your head like, oh man, I just need to say this one thing and just be consistent so that at the very least we have a chance for athletes to follow through. You still have the opportunity to do it. I think if there's opportunities to kind of inform the athlete beyond just the one sentence line you're going to offer them, just to give them momentum. Um, Definitely take advantage of that. If there's some regional support, expert support to help kind of reformulate those principles, but just kind of enhance the broadness of the knowledge so that there's more diversity in strategies as to how to do the same thing. I would say jump on those opportunities because I think then you're kind of creating that adaptable athlete that if they eventually come see jump into a program and they're being serviced with someone with my background, then I would say, man, I got a lot of work with. This is great, and then we could start kind of getting right into business. But like I said, don't hesitate to kind of, I think, start realizing that there's more than one way of doing it. Start with maybe a quick message just to get momentum. But then if you see opportunities to enhance that messaging, 100%, like definitely take advantage of that. The fine tuning is kind of like anything else. I mean, you could teach someone how to lift, but there's probably going to be year after year where you refine the quality of those lifts. And you think the task is simple, just like eating. Like, yeah, it's simple. Just put this in your mouth. But there's a planning component. There's a grace as to how you roll from one day to the other, from one week to the other, from one training block to the other. There's a level of rhythm there that just it doesn't come together in the first crack at bat. It gets fine tuned, it gets honed, and that's assuming the training schedule is the same. Oftentimes, the training might just change, might get readapted to better meet the athlete's needs. That may or may not influence the nutrition patterning, but if it does, that just becomes another thing that the athlete has to evolve themselves into growing and adjust so that they can kind of get everything glued in nice, support quality and the intensity and manage the burden of the training at the volumes high. Yeah. So again, this is just kind of highlighting probably what happens if you don't take care of it from a pre-exercise carbohydrate availability perspective. You're going to get the same kind of symptoms you would get from a bad case of dehydration. So you could technically get the same within the context of fluid and carbohydrate accessibility for workouts. You could technically get the same symptom of fatigue from two different sources. And so sometimes if you see an athlete jerking it really well, but is complaining with fatigue and they don't seem to be sick for some odd reason, it might be the way they're just kind of fueling their carbohydrate requirements leading into the session. If you don't know either of those informations, you could have one, the other, or both happening at the same time, creating that early onset fatigue habit. And so there might be multiple plugs that you're going to have to try to put in place, to kind of work the athlete through their needs, so that you could get kind of the athlete you need in the training session. Now, we touched real quickly on the requirements for carbohydrate, especially if you're doing like a short, quick recovery burst leading into, let's say, another session 6 hours from now. So if you want to kind of maybe do a messaging, I guess one way that might be easy for an athlete to retain is the 4R approach for recovery. So in terms of the rapid recovery, one is protein for recovery, rehydrate, replenish muscle glycogen, and then revitalize the tissue. So then looking at nutrient density. So if we look at carbohydrate, you already know the dose. If we use an 80 kilo athlete, that's going to be a couple of containers of yogurt, like those small breakaways for lunch, 2 to 3 of those, 2 pieces of fruit, 2 cereal bars. Boom, you got the carbohydrate locked in for that size of athlete. You now know that those 3 little yogurt packages will give you close to 20, 25 grams. Boom, you got the protein locked in. The fluid, protein fruits have some fluid, but definitely not 150%, depending on what the athlete lost. So for example, that one example that we gave where the athlete lost a kilo of fluid, for them to replace that fluid quickly, leading into like a session that's booked 6 hours after, they would have to drink 1.5 liters of fluids from all sources. So So that's probably a big thing of a big water bottle, maybe two of those actually, because most of them are 700 mLs. So having two of those bottles that stand by while they're eating this recovery snack, they have the ingredients put together. Now, in terms of revitalize, now we're looking at antioxidants and items like that. So if you're looking at nutrient density, we know milk has protein, it's got calcium, it's got a little bit of vitamin D in there, among other things, depending on the brand. But there's no, so it's good for bone health, etc. But it's not allowing you to, it's not giving you a source of antioxidants to kind of help replenish the system that way. So you have two other food options you can manipulate, which is your two fruits. So fruits are generally rich in antioxidants, and there's some that are higher in antioxidants than others. So if an athlete wants to kind of bias on replenishing, then they would just have to be a little bit more selective rather than running for the two bananas, which is not very antioxidant heavy. Maybe grab a banana and a piece of orange, or they could have some like berries with their Greek yogurt, strawberries, blueberries, doesn't matter. So maybe their fruit choices are going to be more antioxidant heavy to draw in some of those nutrients. And then from a grains perspective, whether you're getting like fruit bars rolled in with cereal, oat that has some level of plant-based iron for iron recovery. Like I said, there's ranges of nutrients that certain foods have in clusters. So when eating them together, you get a way kind of variety punch in the moment. So again, that's just kind of like one way you could just simply put the messaging together so that someone has a visual to apply the science. And so for someone to do that, again, they have to realize and take the time to pack the 3 yogurts, take the time to pick the blueberries instead of the 2 bananas. They have to take the time to have cereal bars or oatmeal made at home to bring to the training site. And there has to be an interest to kind of consistently do that every time you park a double day in a week of training. So again, there's that whole other component that has to be massaged in and appreciated so that it can follow through day after day on the intervention. So you could see the fruits of your labor at the end of the year. Here's an example of really just stringing like a whole food first policy that draws in those proteins, high nutrient dense carbohydrates through grains, and then wrapping up the revitalizing set of nutrients through whether fruits and vegetables. And again, this is like looking at more of I guess the very first option is just looking at like, a lunch or a supper. Same with the one on the bottom, just different recipe, but the principles are all there. And no matter which line you pick, you're going to get those physiological outcomes with different degrees of attention to one thing versus the other. But what they all have, it has the capacity to refuel the muscle, help muscle recovery, push those adaptations that we looked at, assuming you can lock in that 1.6 grams per kilo of protein. But then the melange of everything else will then bias whether you want a heavy antioxidant-rich soup of foods, or do you want an iron-rich heavy? You can sort of custom and adjusting depending on what the priority needs are. Typically, a melange of all this stuff across the week will be very beneficial, assuming there's no specific targeted requirement. And then on the other, when you look at the athlete nutrition development pathway, this simple table will have importance in different ways for those paddlers across the pathway. So if you're looking at the athlete that's in the middle range, or heck, let's start with the small kids, it's just getting familiar with foods, knowing what food is, what does it do. The other one is probably growing that competency when they're in the development space, and then start giving them some autonomy in how to put stuff together and realize that there's some strategies they could start thinking about deliberately to support training. So like the 4 hours, for example, getting themselves to prep that mechanically. And then at the senior level, they just become more and more dependent on these skills that have to put this together, because now training becomes probably the hyper focus of their work time. And so being able to handle those high performance volumes at that quality will just require consistency. You can't fluke the nutrition at that point because it's just going to catch up. So they have to be kind of well comforted and confident in applying this stuff. And then with that base set, then comes in more sophisticated strategies over top to try to get them through over specific targets across the year from a performance perspective. Now, all nice to say food first policy, but in reality, there's probably going to be some that are going to be interested in touching engineered versions of nutrition. In that case, it becomes an important message, definitely in the junior ranks, and it's an ongoing messaging that I do at the senior level, is quality assurance. If there is a valid and a evidence-based product to be used, there's still the need for quality assurance checking on that. And so the one messaging that is clear is that there is no test administered on this planet that gives you 100% assurance that a product is safe and tested completely 100% according to the water list. That system does not exist. What does exist is a pretty good testing certificate program that tests for a very large range of items, and those testing agencies that are kind of like ahead above the rest are the three. I have those logos there, and so in reality, there is no 100% test. There are just some that are really, really good at testing. Those are the three only on the planet. And then there's still the athlete's responsibility to ensure that that specific unit that they bought at that retail store is not just has a sticker on it, but does the stamp below the bottle match the stamp list that got tested? Because there's only a handful of products that are that the company can afford to get tested. So not every skid is tested, only a random set. So maybe one set of skids went to Canada and the other ones went in the US, but the one at your nearest Walmart was the one that did not get tested. So in that point, there's a higher risk there. So there's a question to be made as to whether or not to get it. Informed Sport, which is the gold label of the three there, anything that has that stamp got tested, whereas the ones at the bottom, you have to kind of almost manually check the stamp yourself against the website. And so again, when you go through this exercise, there is a lot of energy spent there, and probably the fastest convenient solution is just buy an extra carton of milk just to get the darn protein in. So sometimes if the athlete is looking, remember I said before, sometimes athletes may reach for the supplement, not so much because of the benefit exclusive reason, but it's just because there's a practical gap around food management that they're trying to bridge. You could see where there's a higher technical risk there versus just go out and buy double the amount of milk you normally buy and just bring it with you in a thermos. So sometimes managing those things are very key. Like I said, there are some exceptions more at the higher level where we're looking at products that you cannot get in food, but we know has a very strong component of evidence to enhance or boost performance. And so those are used in a targeted scenario that may not apply every year or in all competitions. It may apply to specific ones. So then it gets, like I said, a little bit, the priorities are different on that space. That adjusts the strategy. So now in summary, just to kind of bring it all in. So again, nutrition for athletes in the development performance space, it's important to identify the priority needs of the athlete depending on their growth pathway. And then from there, the messaging can be kind of put together and consistently applied. It's just that you have a different angle of focus on the same subject matter, depending on what their development needs are. When you start getting into strategic components, and we've covered three. So one was globally, it's recovery, but we broke that down into protein requirements for lean mass gains and strength and muscle repair. The other one is fluid, and the other one is muscle glycogen refueling for high intensities. So again, protein amount and how it's distributed across the day can have an impact on that lean mass and strength component of training. Eat and drink for effective recovery. Again, we're talking about water or free water and carbohydrates as kind of like the primary targeted nutrients to manage in and around the training. And again, that's more of a dynamic depending on needs there. And then to manage other nutrition goals, it's dependent on the quality of items being assembled. So if you're talking about revitalizing the body using antioxidants. Those antioxidant foods probably also have carbohydrates, but then there's some carbohydrate foods that are not very antioxidant rich. So just having the athlete knowledge and the drive, and hopefully the ability to get access to those foods to assemble together. So that's where the whole food first policy has lots of driving weight to push through a lot of objectives right through the development pathway, right to the elite level. And then if there is a valid reason and effective use of an engineered product, then there is some homework to do in terms of screening for quality assurance. And even with all that effort and network testing available globally, it's still not 100% proof because that system does not exist yet. It's just scales on a probability. So that's just kind of the reality of the makeup of the system. So I'll kind of end it there. There's probably a lot of nuggets and context there to kind of digest. But again, thank you very much for tossing me your ear and having me share this information. And I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Eric. That was really well done, and lots of good practical advice for athletes and for coaches to follow. So super interesting. Thank you so much. I'm seeing a couple of people just type in thanks here on the questions, and I know you were doing a good job there of asking for questions during the presentation. But we did go a little bit over, but perhaps if there's one, maybe two max questions, we can take those now. If not, then feel free to say goodbye and thank Eric for his presentation today. Eric, just while we're, if nobody types anything in, I did have one question. Do you have any resources or social media sites that you follow for new information for ongoing learning with nutrition topics?
Yeah, well, I think it depends on what kind of information you're looking for. So I guess if you're looking at information to share to families and athletes in the development space, I think the Coaching Association website is slowly redeveloping their nutrition inventory. So I think Angel DeFore, who works with another segment of the senior team out in Halifax, is kind of taking the charge on that. As far as like maybe coach kind of higher end learning pieces, I'm pretty sure the coaching certificate pathway. I
Yeah.
think there's some nutrition modules built in there. I
Yeah.
remember presenting on a few of those when I was in Toronto. So depending on, I don't know if the curriculum's changed, but if it has evolved, then that's probably where you
Yeah.
get more granular
I think
information.
the Coaching Association has actually recently launched an e-learning module that people can take through the locker for nutrition, actually. So you can do it online now. So that's fun. Well, thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule and joining us and sharing your knowledge. Much appreciated, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks. Same to you guys, and thanks
Okay,
again for the
great. Well, thanks
invitation.
everybody for joining us, and hope to see you in a couple of weeks when we have our athletes on board. So have a great day and goodbye.